Welcome back to another episode of The Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. My name is Kendall. I am so glad that you are here with me for a new episode, and I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, who I have been following on Instagram for the entirety of my experience here in the living history community, the 18th century living history community. She and the work that she does are huge inspirations for women in this community. So I'm honored to introduce Samantha Vogley, who is the president of On the Army Strength. Samantha, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Kendall.
We're going to have a lot of fun stuff to talk about today. I'll just share that we're going to definitely talk about laundry because who doesn't talk about laundry to you, right?
Yeah, it's definitely my primary subject, but one I love dearly.
Yes. So I'm excited. We'll get to that. But before we start, we go into all of that conversation. I would love to know how you got started in this hobby. Where did it all begin for Samantha?
So I'm part of a unique branch of reenactors who actually grew up in the hobby. I started as a wee baby. My father was in the bicentennial, and he went to Widener University. And then when he left college, he had been reenacting through all that. He left college, went to the Army, spent many years in the Army. And when he came back and they moved back to the States, we moved to Maryland, and he rejoined the 43rd of Foot. And so I spent the first few years of my life as a reenactor in the 43rd. And then we broke off and formed the 1st New Jersey Regiment. And so I have grown up in this hobby, and it's been a cool experience. I think that when you grow up in this hobby, it's very different. You perceive it very differently because it really is your family. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. I grew up with 50 aunts and uncles who raised me, and I grew up in hay forts, and I grew up, in a social atmosphere. And it wasn't until probably like my mid-20s, right after my son was born, that it became about history, and the research train started to drive. So that's my beginning. That's how I got started.
Yeah. I'm always impressed at people who did grow up in this and then have stayed in it. I'm not sure. I don't stick with that much for very long, so I'm not sure if I would have that same experience. But it does sound like a really amazing way to grow up in community. I'm always looking for, communities in life, because I think that's so important to our human nature and our human experience. And it seems like to me, especially from the children that I see now in the living history community, that it is such a great way to experience your childhood, especially connecting to these old ways, just sitting around a fire, understanding, cooking over a fire, which most of us, I grew up a little rural, so I had a little bit of that experience, but on a cattle farm. But I think most people are not getting to have that experience these days, and it's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. My son is growing up in the hobby too. And that's it. It's a way to disconnect from technology and reconnect with the past. And I think it's important, for young ones especially.
Yeah. So you have a very strong connection to women in this hobby and helping women and creating, really positive experiences for women. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I guess for me, it kind of started because when I was growing up, I grew up where women stayed underneath dining flies and cooked and did dishes all weekend long. And I vividly remember them complaining about how, this is a man's hobby, and they go off to war, and they, are stuck in the kitchen. And I even remember my mom, she just, really hated it. She thought that my dad was constantly leaving her behind to tend children and cook. And I think that played a very profound effect on me. And when I started doing this rabbit hole, I was just sitting there thinking to myself, oh no, this has to change. Like, we have to do better, because as much as I like to cook in real life, because I do, it's not right. Like, I don't it's not authentic. Why am I doing this? I should be doing something else. So yeah, that's kind of how the whole thing started. And to be honest with you, my initial plan was just to have this little like social club within reenacting. And that social club exploded. And I was very reluctant to turn it into asking. And I finally yielded and said, okay, let's do it. And the whole purpose of this, was to promote women and promote correct impressions and promote alternative activities.
I love that you have created this community of women, because I am just a huge supporter of women. I'm a huge supporter of there's plenty of pie for everyone. Let's all support each other, lift each other up. And it is obvious that that is what you have created, just following on social media to see. I don't know, you can just tell. And I really appreciate that. People who are new, they're just kind of getting into this. And we're saying women don't really cook. And they're like, well, what do women do? Right. So let's talk a little bit for people who are new. Let's share with them a little bit about what women do following the Army.
So our primary occupation was laundry. Now that wasn't our only occupation. Nursing would definitely be the second most common, but the primary occupation was laundry. And this was because women fulfilled the similar domestic duties that they would have done at home. But in the continent, or in this time period of all the combative forces, they were assimilated into what's called a mess group. And this mess group was responsible for sleeping together, eating together, etc. And women were actually segregated from the main army during campaign seasons. So there's really no point in cooking if men are taking care of that in their mess groups, and we're kind of segregated from them. And so when we were with our, male family members, we might, assimilate into their mess group. But for the most part, we're doing laundry. And we know this because we see it in orderly books and manuscripts. And it's the most common talked about thing with women is, hey, they're doing laundry.
Maybe talk a little bit about what goes into a laundry impression. I think a lot of people are interested now, especially because I think they're seeing photos of you guys doing laundry and it looks really cool. Although I know it's usually either really hot or really cold. So probably not always as fun as the photographs make it seem. But if somebody is interested in doing a laundry impression for their regiment, what are some things that go into that besides purchasing the equipment?
Sure. Well, first you have to understand, the context and the steps of the laundry process and how it was kind of done in the 18th century. And there are many different manuals that were kind of written by women, and it's kind of like a housewife's guide, and it covers a broad spectrum of things, but laundry is one of them. And so they will actually go into the steps of like how to properly do laundry and how to do stain treatments and things of that nature. So it's good to get really familiar with those types of manuals. Then you have to kind of translate it into a military context, because civilian life and military life in this period are two entirely different things. And military life is, it's rough. It is a very rough way of living. And we as followers were very poor working class, and we weren't treated very well. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. But laundry in a military setting was a very crude and underdeveloped chore. So you have to really understand how provisional deficiencies would have affected the entire process of laundry. So after you kind of get familiar with some of the background stuff, you want to make sure that you're always connected to water and wood. That's the biggest thing. You want to have some equipment out, like, wooden wash basins and things like that, tripods, a brass kettle, lye soap, and not scented lye soap. That's another thing people assume. Lye soap is super crude in this military context as well. It's like literally wood ash and animal fat mixed together and congealed. into a nice little soft or hard soap that they would wash clothes with. So, so nice little amazing lye soap, and you know, shirts are the easiest thing to do. And then also keeping in mind that really the steps that you're taking are for demonstrative purposes. You know, I know a lot of women kind of come in and they're like, oh, I want to do, you know, stain treatments and I want to try all these things out. And that's great. I'm definitely not saying you can't. But it's the difference between waking up at 4 a.m. to start laundry, which is what they would have done,
Right.
and starting laundry at 10 a.m. just to talk about it. So you have to really know like what you're trying to demonstrate and use your time appropriately. And the steps are pretty simple. I mean, you know, you kind of want to start scrubbing shirts, whether, you know, they're clean or dirty, but start scrubbing them in your wash basins and utilizing bats to, you know, beat some of the dirt out, and boil them in a brass kettle and rinse them and hang them out to dry and keep it simple, you know, and then just talk about, you know, the complexities and talk about like the full shebang of what they would have done.
You made a really good point, because you get excited and you want to do all these things, but if you're in a context of an event, you might have 100 visitors and you might get 30 seconds of their attention.
Yeah. And you want to make it count. I mean, like for me personally, when I talk about it, I've never done well in first person. Like I'm an educator. When I talk to the public, I talk to them in a 21st century context. And I make it relatable and I make it fun, because that's how I get their attention for that 30 seconds. And one of my favorite tricks is in the 18th century laundry, they had a system that's called bucking. And bucking was when they would soak clothing overnight in aged urine. So I always fill a bucket with dirty water.
And then tell people that that's what it is.
Yeah. And I love doing it. And I always pause on urine because it takes them a second and then they're like, ah, you know?
The best part is that you said aged, though. That's the best part about that entire sentence.
Yeah, yes, right? I know. And they're always like, aged? Oh my gosh. But it's true. And the reason why they aged it was because it produced ammonia. And what's the number one ingredient in household cleaners is ammonia or some sort of chemical derivative of that.
Exactly.
So it kind of touches on science, it touches on the history, but it also makes them laugh and it makes them go, wow, you know, like those aha light bulb moments. So you really have to know and be vigilant of what you're talking about.
I got tired of just kind of sitting around the campfire waiting for people to come over and figuring out what to kind of talk about. And so I wanted to be doing something, showing something, and again, like just being inspired by watching you guys and what you were doing, and then doing some, you know, doing a lot of research and realizing this laundry thing, man, this is huge, and we just don't have tons of that here in the South going on at the events that I attend. You just don't really see it. So I thought, well, that would be exciting if we have more regiments bringing laundry in, because I think it is such an accurate way to talk about the lives of these women that were there. What are some interesting things that you've learned about the women of this time and their community and their culture along with the Army?
I wanted to quickly just touch on what you had said about there not being much in the way of laundry as far as impression goes.
Yeah.
That is universal. That is all up and down the East Coast.
Okay.
It is the most underrepresented impression. And quite frankly, we need more. I mean, we need more. And
do you think it's just the access to the materials? Do you think it's just, what do you think is keeping regiments from doing that?
Yes, I think it's a lot of it is access to material. I also feel, and this is something again that you know I certainly have been trying to change, is that we have an old school way of event organization, and the way that has been is that we have two military leaders from either side of the combative forces who come together to put on an event. And that's all fine. I get it. It's a military event, but somebody needs to be your civilian coordinator. Somebody does, you know, whether, and for both sides, somebody needs to be on the British side, somebody needs to be on the Continental Forces side. And you need to work with those civilian coordinators to have things like laundry and brigade settlers and camp markets, because these are all documented activities and they are the bread and butter. People love them. People want to talk about it. And so the more that we press that, and it's just like, you know, the military has staff, you know, you have your brigade major and so forth, and we represent a military structure when we do an event organization. And I get that the civilian aspect might not be military, but you still need them in your staff, you know?
Absolutely.
So it's a lot about what events are offering. It's the access to the materials. These are all things that I think are starting to change, and we need more people to push that. We need to rise more women up to these leadership roles so that they can fulfill these for events, you know? But yeah, that's definitely it. And the more that we have that, I think the more people would be willing to go, okay, yeah, let's do this impression. So as far as your question, as with women and what I've learned about them, that is an excellent question. It's one of my favorites, okay?
Oh, good.
Because what I have learned about followers of the, especially Continental Forces, is that we were rough. We were rough. We were a bunch of smoking, cursing, disobedient women, and it's awesome. When I started reading more and descriptions of these followers, and I realized that, you know, we were of this nature, I'm like, whoa, like, this is why I'm so attracted to them. And, you know, one of my favorite narratives is Joseph Plum Martin's description of us as he was watching us kind of march, you know, we were like following with the baggage wagons near Philadelphia. And he called us a caravan of wild beasts. In varying dialects, and, you know, we're rough and ragged, and we had, you know, odd and disgusting bodies. And basically what he's saying is that, you know, we were poor, and following the army made us, it was even worse, you know, because a lot of the time we're following the army because we're unable to procure occupations on our own. And so the army provided us food, shelter, maybe a little currency. And that doesn't mean, though, that it was a whole lot. And then there's a lot of traveling involved. And then there's provisional deficiencies in the state's inability to properly fund the army. And if the men aren't getting fed, women are definitely not getting fed. And then there was a letter that was written for them to fund a little bit of silk for these women so that they could, you know, get properly dressed, because they barely had anything on. It was so ripped and tattered.
I like that that's the place they went to. They were like, oh, these women are ripped and tattered, so let's give them silk. That's the extreme.
Yeah, exactly. I think that would kind of make sense, because when you look at it, like silk bonnets and things like that, that was worn by all classes.
Sure,
you know?
true. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't know if it was necessarily considered as much of a luxury as it is now, you know. But yeah, but the fact that he's even like, yo, these women, they be looking rough.
They're bad. They're bad. Let's fix this up a little bit. They're not looking good for Washington.
Exactly. And then it's funny too, because we look at runaway ads, right? And that's really, you know, runaway ads. I love runaway ads.
Oh, I do too. They're so cool.
Yeah. They're so cool, and they're so descriptive of even like personalities and appearances. And I started going through runaway ads for the southern region from Maryland down, mostly for my own personal research, because Black is my signature color. And I was like, I started noticing Black coming up a lot in mid-Atlantic regions. And so I started to follow through.
You wanted to be able to wear what you love and be able to back it up.
Exactly. And it's a misconception.
That's your research.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I really am so punk rock. It's crazy.
I love it.
But yeah, like it was a misconception that it was for a color for a widow. So I kind of debunked that. But in these runaway ads, especially for descriptions of like followers, servants that were running away to follow the army, there was a lot of descriptions of them where, again, they're rough and ragged and they're cursing and they should have big old pipes in their mouth. Like, I could not believe it. And, you know, their teeth are, you know, yellow and, you know, from excessive smoking and things of that nature. Or their face is pitted with smallpox. And I'm like, God, this is great.
Oh, let me ask you about this. What about the prostitute story? You know, that's really what a lot of people believe. A lot of historians who are educators, not necessarily in our community, but people, you know, that's the story. Camp followers were prostitutes.
Yeah. Yes. And it is a very touchy subject for me because, you know, the thing is that prostitution, of course, is going to happen in military encampment. And I know we know that it happened for sure because of the sheer amount of guys that were coming up with venereal diseases at, you know, the military hospitals. So we know it's happening. However, there are rules and there are exceptions to the rules. And the rule is that the majority of women were attached to a male family member, meaning it was the majority their husband or it was their father or brother, because in this time period, men are legally responsible to take care of the women in their family. That does not mean they're beating them all the time. That does not mean, you know, that's not the narrative we're speaking of. It doesn't mean they're prostitutes. It literally means that they have no other option but to follow dad or husband into war. So the prostitution thing, yes, of course it happened, but we're talking maybe 1%. And it's the inappropriate narrative we need to be telling because the other thing people need to realize is that if you're a prostitute in this time period, we are not talking about harlots on Hulu. You know, we are talking,
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. This was a very demoralizing job. And again, it's because they do not have the choice. Right. We're talking about very ill-educated women. We're talking about women who are frequently abused, both physically and mentally. So it's not the correct narrative. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, but I'm just saying if we're going to do impressions, let's do the right thing.
Yeah. What do you think about the Molly Pitcher stories of the Revolutionary War? What do you think about the women who brought their water to their men? I mean, you know, it's like there's this camp follower story, and then there's this more rare story of the woman who picks up a musket or goes and fires a cannon. Or
we have a profound thing in our society where we glamorize a lot of figures. We see this a lot, especially with George Washington, you know, so every painting that you see of George Washington, everything you know about George Washington is how awesome he is. Mm-hmm. And all the paintings are like, you know, godlike tributes to this man. And the reality is that he was an a-hole.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm gonna be for real. If anybody's actually ever read his manuals, he is a jerk. But he has to be. That's what makes a good military leader. Right. So in the stories of like Molly Pitcher is a tall tale. It is. That's not to say that we do have descriptions of women in battle-like scenarios helping man cannons or giving water. We do have those. But again, there's rules and there's exceptions to the rules. So we're not totally sure. And even in these descriptions of period manuals, you know, what they're seeing and what actually happened may be two different things. Because even I believe it was Joseph Plummartin, I might be mistaken, but I believe it was him who recalled a woman who got, you know, a cannonball in between the legs and like it ripped her skirts.
Oh, yeah.
Wait, what? I'm pretty sure they explode. Or I mean, like, you know,
I know. Or they're like, what is that? Really? Yeah.
Yeah. So
that sounds like a sit around at the tavern after a few brewskis and come up with a story to tell all the boys to, yeah.
Exactly.
I remember reading that and being like, I don't think
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's things that we have to keep in mind. And I understand too with women because they're trying to find impressions. And I know that there are women out there who in their petticoats want to man muskets. And they want to fulfill maybe this frontier narrative that is also maybe not quite correct.
Right.
I get it. I totally get it. But it's just not what we should be doing. And if you want to man a musket, man, put on a pair of breeches. Like, who
Yeah.
says you
Yeah.
can't do that? Put
Exactly.
on a regimental, fire that musket. You go,
Yeah.
girl. You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
But be a
Yeah.
man. Be a
Yeah.
man.
But
That's what
that's
you should
the,
do.
I think it's hard in our day and age of feminism and who we are as women now and what we believe, and we know our abilities and things. And I think you've touched on it before, you know, the figures that the things that we create and lift up. I think there's a part of us that just wants to believe that for those of us especially who had, you know, women who were here during the founding, and we want to believe that those women um were strong and had this independence, and as strong as they may have been, they did not have the independence that we have now. And I think it's hard to reconcile that story, because if we're strong, independent women now, we want to portray this idea of our ancestral women as being what we are now. And that's not the case.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're absolutely right. It is our modern feminist views for sure. And you know, along with this modern feminism, what we have done in our current society is we've actually kind of disregarded the roles of being a homemaker, you know, because we're so like anti homemaker, like the whole 50s, it's suppression, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is that it's not. The whole point is it should have been a choice. And we never
Right.
had the choice, you
Right.
know, and, you know, we never had the choice in the 18th century. You know, it was this was your role. This is who you were. And you were seen but not heard. And we really didn't even want to see you. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that especially why we are telling the story is because we want to promote modern feminism. We want to educate about the correct narrative so that we do not go back to that. Because the reality is that there are people in this world, especially in America, unfortunately, who feel that we should go back to this time period. And I'm constantly like, okay, you know, 1787 called and they want their ideals back. But you know, the reality, it's true. And so the purpose is to open the conversation and to really talk about this, because if we don't talk about it, how are we going to ensure it doesn't happen?
Right.
You know, and suppression of women is a real thing.
Do you watch Handmaid's Tale?
Yes, and dear Lord, that first season, I'm like, oh my God, this could really happen. This really could happen.
Last week, I was like, this could really happen. And there hasn't been a new season in a while. And I was like, this last week, I was literally thinking, this could really happen. Okay, so before we wrap up here, what advice do you have for people who are, you know, women especially, who are just getting into this? They're maybe just kind of like sitting outside, looking in, lurking, being like, all right, I've got to work the next 2 years to get the right outfit together so I can go get started and do this. Whatever the situation may be, what's like the number one advice that you give people? Because I imagine people are coming to you like on the daily asking questions.
So the first thing you're going to do, stop worrying about getting a kit together. Stop worrying about building an impression. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to find a group who supports you and who has similar values. You know, we are fortunate in this hobby that we have all different kinds of regimens of varying longevity. Some are new, some are old. Some are more conservative, some are more liberal. Some are more into accurate impressions, others are more into the social aspect. It's about finding the regiment that works for you. And you want to find a regiment that, you know, really does promote women and promote not just women in impressions in camp, but promote them in their politics as a club. Do you have female board members? So that's, you definitely need to find that. You need to find somebody who's local and join them and ask for mentorship and sync yourself up with somebody who has done this for a while and has a good kit and knows research and can steer you in the right direction, because there's no point in buying things unless you know for sure that it's what you need,
Right.
because this is an expensive hobby. And that's the other thing too that I always try to tell people. Find a regimen that has loaner gear that you can wear for a little bit, and give yourself some grace, because there are so many of us who literally could do before and after photos. And, we all have excellent kits and excellent impressions, but if you looked at us 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So give yourself grace,
Yeah.
but yeah, find a group with similar ideals and what you're looking for sure.
And if you get into a group and you realize this isn't the group for me, you're not married to them. You can leave the group. You can find a different group. That's okay too.
Exactly. We're volunteers. So no, you are not married to that group, and you can totally say, I resign and go somewhere else. That's fine. No, there's no hard feelings. We're all one big family anyways.
Exactly. One large dysfunctional family. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Samantha Vogley, thank you so much. This has been a great and informative conversation, and I hope you'll come back eventually and have more of these great conversations. Appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much.